Good morning. We are so glad to have all of you here, our panel, making their way to the stage, getting settled. We will go ahead and begin our program this morning. I'm Emily Iazetti. I am the Texas Tribune's membership manager. Thank you for being here in person in Austin for our folks that are here, and also everyone joining us online for today's discussion, Pregaming the 2024 Texas primary elections. Because I am the membership manager, I want to start by recognizing our members who are here. I've gotten to say hello to several of you, and I know lots of members watching online as well. Texas Tribune members make everything that we do possible, including these free live public events, which is a real priority for the Tribune. So thank you so much for our members who make this possible. If you enjoy today's event in person or online, we hope that you will join us as a member. Donate button is very easy to find on our website. In person, we've got some QR codes in the back of the room. One more note before we get started, I want to make sure and highlight our We the Texans Symposium, a symposium on the state of democracy that's happening Tuesday, February 27th at the University of Houston downtown. It will also be online. It's an all-day event. It includes panels on Texas voter turnout problem, also on young Texans and how they're impacting their communities. Lots more details about that event on the events section of the Texas Tribune website. Today's program is going to run an hour. We'll have 45 minutes for our conversation and then 15 minutes for questions, both from our in-person and online audiences at the end. Our virtual audience can submit questions online at our Q&A portal. That's at texastribune.org/ask. Again, texastribune.org/ask. We will be incorporating some of those online questions. So with that, we will go ahead and get to our panel for today. We are joined by Karen Brooks Harper. She's the Health and Human Services reporter for the Texas Tribune. She's also been helping very heavily with the election coverage. Zach Despart is our politics reporter for the Tribune. And then we're also joined by Jasper Scherer, who's a state politics reporter for the Houston Chronicle and also the San Antonio Express News. Our moderator is Tribune politics editor Rebekah Allen. Thanks to all of you for being here. And Rebekah, I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We are less than 2 weeks away from Election Day, but early voting started yesterday. It is underway until March 1st, and most Texans cast their ballot during early voting, so we are right in the thick of this. So who is running? Well, of course, we have at the top of the ticket the party nominees for President of the United States. That's going to take up a lot of oxygen, but you know, our focus really is more on the down ballot candidates. So we have U.S. Senate, we have every member of Congress, every member of the Texas House, half of the Texas Senate. We have a few members of the Court of Criminal Appeals, the Supreme Court, the Texas Supreme Court. We have local races like district attorneys and sheriffs. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of these races. I want to start off with a statistic, though, to set the stage. So in the 2022 primary, only 18% of registered voters voted. And certainly more will come out in November, driven largely because of the main event, the presidential election. But I often like to make the case to people who say that their vote doesn't count, that if they feel that way, that they should vote in the primary. The top of the ticket will be an uncompetitive Democratic presidential primary and a slightly more competitive but still very uncompetitive Republican primary where Donald Trump leads Nikki Haley by more than 50 points. So with all of that said, Karen, I was wondering if you could start us off by talking a little bit about why the primary in Texas is so consequential, is so important, why people should be tuning in and not waiting to get engaged until November.
Happy to. Thanks, Rebekah. Well, because there's not a lot of decisions being made in November by the time you get there. And the reason for that is that the Texas districts, House and Senate, have been so gerrymandered, redistricted, redrawn favorably to either party that there are very few districts anymore that are actually competitive, you know, what some might call purple, flipping back and forth between, you know, Democrat and Republican. So the contest for most of the districts in Texas is happening in the primary. Whoever wins the primary is going to automatically slide in the general. There are plenty of districts that don't even have, although I don't know how many this time around, but there are districts that don't even have opponents on both sides, I think. At least that was the way it is in the past, it's usually. But the bottom line is that that the very few districts in Texas, that can be flipped, it's just not very often. It's a very, very strong dynamic in Texas that whoever wins the primary is going to win the general, basically because the districts are so heavily Democratic or Republican. Very few competitive areas. Is that?
Totally, yeah. I mean, and we're coming right off of a redistricting session in 2022. So the Texas Legislature spent that time like really shoring up the districts for their incumbents. So we're kind of less competitive now than we have been even in recent years. So thanks for that, Karen. And feel free, guys, to just jump in on things. We have a lot of ground to cover, but if something interests you, like just let's stay on it. Jasper, I know you've been covering a lot of the congressional races and looking toward D.C. Could you talk to us a little bit about the dynamics in the U.S. Senate race? Ted Cruz is up for re-election again. This is the first time since the 2018 Beto O'Rourke run. Can you lay out sort of the state of the Democratic primary in this race?
Sure. So I think the main drama in that contest so far has been just whether it's going to go to a runoff. There's so many candidates running, and that's whenever you've got 10, 12 people running, it's just a matter of whether anyone's going to clear that 50% plus one threshold. Colin Allred, congressman from the Dallas area, has been sort of leading the pack, just running laps around everyone with, in terms of fundraising. The few public polls that we've seen so far, he's been kind of right up at that 50% threshold. I think the most recent one actually had him slightly clearing 50%. So his main rival is Roland Gutierrez, a state senator from San Antonio, but really his district is, it covers a huge swath of the border. So Roland has been talking a lot about gun control. He's kind of shaped his campaign around that. He represents Uvalde and has focused a lot on just the sort of perceived inaction after the massacre at the elementary school. So I think those are kind of the two leading contenders. There's a whole bunch of other folks who are sort of in that 2 to 3% range whenever the polls come out. So I think that's the main thing, is if Allred gets stuck at 49% or below, that's what we're watching.
Is that among those two front runners, Colin Allred and Roland Gutierrez, is it a race of electability, or are there like meaningful policy differences between the two of them?
I think a lot of it does come down to electability, and it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, like what defines electability. There's kind of competing camps. I think every time, every election cycle, it's which approach is the most likely to take down Ted Cruz. I think from Allred's perspective, he's been sort of trying to kind of, I guess, I don't know if this is fair to say, but sort of coast through the primary without taking any positions that might upset, sort of independent or slightly right-leaning voters. I guess the most high-profile example of this was when he, back in January, voted in favor of a Republican resolution in Congress that essentially blamed Biden for, for the quote-unquote open borders crisis, that, sort of siding with Republican, basically trying to give himself cover on this issue would be the uncharitable way to look at it. And, Gutierrez has hit him on that, and I think that's the highest profile example of where their strategies kind of diverge. Is, Gutierrez has been basically making the case that we shouldn't try to appease, shouldn't essentially cave to the language that Republicans are going for on issues like the border.
Great. Let's keep making our way down the ballot. There's a number of interesting and really competitive congressional primaries, driven primarily because we have a handful of open seats. Representative Kate Granger and Michael Burgess are retiring, and that's led to some really crowded primaries. Also, Colin Allred's open seat because he's running for Senate. But I'm curious if you would count Representative Sheila Jackson Lee's reelection as among those competitive races. Do you think she's in danger?
It's kind of been the big question in Houston these days. I mean, I think that's it's certainly, we can say it's the most that she's been in danger pretty much for her whole career, which is coming up on 30 years now. I think just her main challenger is Amanda Edwards, who's a former city council member who was elected at large. She was elected citywide, so she's got the thought is that, she's got a lot more name ID in the district than pretty much anyone else who's ever challenged Sheila Jackson Lee before. I think, Jackson Lee was kind of caught a little flat-footed on the fundraising front, just understandably coming off her mayoral race. But, I think kind of the combination of those factors, the fact that Jackson Lee was, beaten pretty badly in the runoff in the Houston mayoral race, just, right before she had to decide whether to seek another term in Congress. I think that's sort of created the idea that she could be vulnerable, and no one's really explored that question in pretty much her whole career. So I think it is competitive, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question in Houston politics, because she has served in Congress since the early 90s. It's almost, for most of Amanda Edwards' life at this point, has become a very senior member of the Democratic Party. She represents a pretty poor majority black district in Houston and has done a tremendous job delivering for that district, and she's well respected within the district for that. Jasper mentioned that she really got walloped in the mayoral race by John Whitmire, and part of that was because she's very popular in her district and very unpopular outside of her district. That's not a problem for her, of course, in this runoff race, but there's a question among Houston Democrats about at what point is it time for someone like Sheila Jackson Lee, who is getting pretty old at this point, to sort of turn over the reins to a younger member of the party who can really be a member of that district for a long time, because of course it takes so long in the House to build seniority, and the way you do that is by having a lot of terms. So there have been a lot of Democrats who are reluctant to endorse against Sheila Jackson Lee because of how powerful she is. But I think privately a lot of them would tell you that they are open to a change, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think and it's also kind of an interesting, almost political experiment in how Amanda Edwards is outflanking Jackson Lee on the fundraising front. She is picking up some endorsements, but it's Sheila Jackson Lee's just never had to raise money. She's never been a prolific fundraiser because she hasn't had to be. So I think it's just a pure can money and sort of some of these other factors outweigh this 30-year incumbency advantage.
Let's talk about the legislature. So every member of the House and half of the Senate is up for re-election. Abbott is not on the ballot, but he kind of is. Zach, can you talk to us about how Abbott is looming over this race?
Yeah, this is a fascinating Republican primary in Texas this year, in part for two reasons. I guess we'll talk about the governor first, but the governor's top legislative priority last year, which was sort of surprised some people, was school vouchers, which he had been sort of warm in the past now, but never had really made that his top thing, and he did. He went all in on it. Spent most of the year and a lot of political capital trying to get a voucher bill passed, and the House killed it. I mean, we did a story toward the end of last year about how essentially the governor was unwilling to compromise on the size of the program and make it less than sort of the universal eligibility that he had wanted, and the core group of rural Republicans in the House who have long been resistant to vouchers ensured that bill would not pass in the House. So the governor has taken a different tack than he sort of has in the past, where he had threatened last year during the special sessions that if the House didn't pass the bill, that he would endorse against, campaign against the Republicans who held out on him. He's made good on that. He's endorsed a couple dozen candidates who are challenging the incumbent Republicans at this point. And he's banking on his popularity, which was quite broad in Texas, because he says that these people should be thrown out, that the people in these districts, the voters, will agree and do that. I've been out to some of these districts, talked to some of these members who are anti-voucher, and they're confident. I mean, they're essentially saying, I was just out in Abilene 2 weeks ago talking with Stan Lambert. He's like, look, the governor doesn't live in my district, doesn't vote in my district, doesn't know my constituents as well as I do. I feel pretty confident that my vote is good. So in a lot of ways, the vouchers, this election has sort of become a referendum on the influence of the governor in these rural areas. But while the governor jumped into these races because of vouchers, when you actually talk to voters, that's actually not one of the issues that they cite the most. I mean, they talk heavily about border security. I know that we'll get to that later in the panel, but I think that hurts the governor because it's not a top-of-mind issue for voters, and polling has suggested that these rural Republicans are on safe ground when they say that they are anti-voucher.
It is interesting because he really is going in on some of these incumbents who he's had good relationships with in the past. Karen, I know this is something that we've been talking about. Like, what are you seeing in terms of the reception from some of these lawmakers? Do you get the sense that they're like having any regrets? Do you feel like that there's like a sense of betrayal? Like, what are you seeing in terms of how they're responding to Abbott's kind of sometimes personal attacks against them?
Yeah, they're mad and the gloves are off, and quite a few of them are not holding back. So, for example, west of Fort Worth, you have, you have Glenn Rogers versus Mike Olcott. This is a matchup we saw 2 years ago. Glenn Rogers, who the incumbent, pulled it out, but now they're facing each other in the primary again. And Paxton and Attorney General Ken Paxton and Greg Abbott have both come out in favor of his opponent. And in fact, at an Olcott fundraiser a couple weeks ago, Abbott was asked, why is he not endorsing Rogers this time around when he has endorsed him in the past, and he has. And Greg Abbott just flat out said, I made a mistake. And when you make a mistake, you got to correct it. And that's just kind of a crystallizing moment in this, because you have a lot of the reps, and I'm speaking about reps mostly here in this particular context, who enjoyed Abbott's support in the past, who have voted basically in lockstep with him or with the Republican Party leadership or with the Republicans in the Senate, the caucus, like dutiful, Republican or partisan, state reps. It certainly isn't, it's just the Republicans that demand some party loyalty here, but that's who we're talking about at the moment, so that's what I'm referring to. But then all of a sudden you have one vote, maybe two, if you want to count the impeachment. But for Abbott, who's not really playing on that side of the argument, the litmus test is the vouchers, and no matter kind of what they did in the past. Glenn Rogers is an example. He's never been in favor of vouchers. Ernest Bales has never been in favor of vouchers. Travis Clardy, not in favor of vouchers. Drew Darby, they're all getting hit by Abbott after Abbott has endorsed them in the past, and none of them are staying silent about it. So, I think that what they're doing, and this is probably going to be effective in a lot of circles in their districts, is reminding their voters that these are what they call outside forces coming in to try to sway their election against the interests of their districts. A lot of these rural districts are not in favor of vouchers because they fear it will drain their public schools, among other reasons. That's the big one. And so, if you can make the carpetbagger argument to your rural Texas district, that's a very powerful argument, even more so than it would be in a suburban or urban district, I would think. So the reception is not positive at all. And other than the one or two state reps who have publicly or privately, walked back their impeachment votes, I don't see anybody changing their voucher votes. And I see a lot of confidence, like you said, in those primaries.
Yeah, I think it's worth highlighting that there certainly is political upside for the governor if he is able to dislodge these voucher opponents. They are the main obstacle remaining to a voucher bill passing the legislature. I also think it's worth highlighting the downside if he loses this sort of push. It's generally difficult to defeat incumbents in Texas. That's just sort of how it's built structurally. And the governor has had mixed success in the limited instances in the past where he has endorsed against incumbent legislators. And in this case, if he were to lose, I think that it's evidence that his influence is waning in the legislature. And also, I think he'll have a hard time on other priorities in the future. Looking back to last year, a lot of legislators are already sort of upset with him. He had, when the legislature was not passing the property tax bill, if you remember all the way back to the summer of last year, the governor vetoed.
It's been so long.
I know,
it's been so long.
Eight sessions ago. The governor vetoed dozens of bills in retaliation for the property tax thing. A lot of those bills were local bills. They had nothing to do with anything. They were non-controversial, and legislators were pissed because they had already told people back home, hey, I got this thing done. And the indiscriminate vetoing really upset a lot of them. Also, the governor never brought those bills back, so they have to start over again next session. So there's already bad blood there. There's bad blood over this voucher fight. If the governor does not dislodge these people and they return to Austin next year, he will have a much harder time with other priorities he has.
Yeah, and let's not talk about, let's not even go into yet the dynamic that'll happen if Phelan comes back next session too. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is that Abbott's got some money behind this behind this effort now, because he got a $6 million donation from a pro-voucher guy in December that his campaign said was the single largest political donation in Texas history. And so there's some money behind that.
I think the shortened version of all this is, if you thought this past year was messy, next year is going to be that on like mega steroids if, a lot of these members come back and Abbott kind of swings and misses. Yeah.
Definitely. And that's not the only revenge tour that's happening politically. We also have Attorney General Ken Paxton, who's also out for blood for all of the House members who voted to impeach him. He was acquitted in the Senate. Are these two concerted efforts? Are these two overlapping efforts? Do we get the sense that Paxton and Abbott, who are both trying to remove House members, are working together, or does it feel like two forces that are kind of at odds?
I think they're, in some cases, like two ships passing in the night, right? I mean, and in many cases, they overlap where they both endorse the same challenger. It's a little bit weird in the sense that Abbott's push is primarily policy-oriented, where he wants the vouchers and he needs the people to get it. Paxton, it's mostly vengeance, right? Like, it's just revenge against people who...
Naked vengeance.
Yeah, and I mean, he says that in his own words.
Against most of the Republicans in the House.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about a sliver like the 20 or so that are targeted by Abbott. It was the majority of
70%,
Republicans.
yeah.
Yeah, 70% of Republicans voted for impeachment. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Again, it's not an issue that is top of mind when you talk to voters. I mean, when you ask them about impeachment, in the polling bears this out, like most Republican voters do not support it. They largely make arguments that Paxton's defense team had made about process without engaging with the set of facts, because the set of facts is pretty ugly when you drill down into it. Paxton is banking on the ability to like really rile up the grassroots about this and sort of show his influence within the party. I mean, I think that the ability of some of these challengers to win that Paxton has endorsed, especially I think it's easier to look at the races where the incumbent didn't also support vouchers, because you can sort of isolate that sentiment, will really show how much influence the Paxton far right wing of the party actually has.
I think from a numbers perspective, Abbott and Paxton are supporting opposing candidates in more races than they're aligned behind the same person, and I think that's mostly because there are just so many, like we were saying, 70% of Republicans voted for impeaching Paxton. Also, the vast majority voted in favor of vouchers. So you have a lot of situations where Abbott is, he's not only trying to get rid of, anti-voucher incumbents, but he's also supporting incumbents who've stuck with him. So in a lot of those cases, you've got, kind of this pretty unusual clash of these like super powerful Republican leaders. We really don't see that very often, if ever, in recent history.
I want to add one more thing to that, too. In Travis Clardy's Nacogdoches district, Travis Clardy is one of the Republicans that does not support vouchers, but also did not support the impeachment. So when Ken Paxton endorsed Clardy, Paxton got blowback from the pro-voucher crowd. And Paxton posted on his X feed, I'm still not used to that, posted on his X that social media.
Formerly Twitter.
All right, Twitter, yeah, it's X. Social media, we'll just call it social media. Post on social media. Sorry you don't like him for whatever reason you don't like him, but he stood up for Texas, and so I'm standing behind him. It's not typical, because as we've already established, most of the Republicans aren't in that position, but Clardy is thankful for Paxton's endorsement, given that Abbott is working so hard against him. So I guess we see who wins that one too, huh?
What does the ground game look like for Abbott and Paxton? I mean, as we've mentioned, Abbott has $6 million from Jeff Yass, Jeff Yass, and and his own war chest. Ken Paxton does not have as much money. I mean, he's using a lot of his own campaign funds for his legal bills. How is that playing out? And Jasper, can you talk a little bit about like how they're messaging, like trying to break through to voters who are really not that interested in issues like vouchers and the impeachment?
Yeah, I think, I mean, first of all, it's Abbott and sort of the voucher-focused contingent, which is not just the governor, but you've got all these, this sort of network of political action committee groups that are pouring even more money in. So just when you're looking at those head-to-head races where it's kind of Abbott versus Paxton proxy wars, the fundraising might is pretty much always on the side of the voucher folks. But I think one dynamic that we've seen, which I think multiple publications have written about now, is that as Zach was saying, vouchers are not a real top-of-mind issue for the majority of Republican primary voters. Ironically, you could say the same for impeachment. So it's kind of funny we're talking about these two issues that are sort of front and center in the kind of the political sphere. But when you look at actually going into all these districts, it's border security. And I guess an issue that's sort of tied to, or at least that Governor Abbott has tried to tie to vouchers, is sort of the claims that children are being indoctrinated in these by their liberal teachers, and these all the discussion about critical race theory and whatnot. I think Abbott has really been trying to kind of leverage those two issues that are much bigger political winners, and I think we've seen that you're asking about on the ground. Whenever we see Abbott going around to these, he's been very active on the campaign trail, going around basically throughout the state. And if you listen to his campaign speeches, his stump speeches, it's filled with talking about border security and sort of in the case of incumbents, giving them credit for funding this multi-billion-dollar Operation Lone Star effort. With incumbents who were against him on vouchers, sort of trying to thread this needle where he's claiming that they were against him on the border, even though they still voted for all of the same things that the pro-voucher folks supported. So it's, I think the takeaway is just, it's been all about the border and sort of the, critical race theory universe of issues. That's overshadowed vouchers significantly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's worth noting that the smartest thing politically, I think, that Speaker Phelan ensured last year was the passage of the two border bills in the special sessions in the fall, the one to fund more border barriers, the other one to make entry across the border a state crime, because that has significantly shored up the arguments of a lot of the House Republicans where voters just repeatedly cite the border as a top issue. If they had not done that, I think that a lot more of these House incumbents would be vulnerable. And when you talk to, I've been traveling around the state the past few weeks talking to some of the challengers, and a lot of them, they do try their darndest to hit the incumbents on border issues, but when you drill down to like how did the incumbent fail on this, it's harder for them to articulate an argument about like, oh, well, they didn't pass the border bill fast enough, or it didn't spend enough money, where it's not as easy as saying like they didn't get the job done, period. So it's really sort of deflated a lot of that argument.
And one thing I've seen is both sides sort of argue that, the voucher proposal was within a larger school funding bill that would have provided billions of dollars for schools, one-time bonuses for teachers. All of that went away when the voucher bill didn't pass. So we've seen both sides kind of weaponize who killed school funding. So I mean, could you just sort of like articulate, Jasper, for us, like who killed school funding? Well,
also, it's another one that's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I think when you drill down to it, a lot of these Republicans who voted to strip vouchers out of that bill have been, they are throughout their careers, when they were first running for their seats, they've consistently talked about wanting more funding for public schools, wanting to give teacher pay raises, basically all the things that they're being accused of killing. But on the other hand, the argument is that, when that bill was brought to the floor, it was basically laid out by the bill author and even by Governor Abbott in his sort of, he laid out the stakes beforehand. It was basically, I'm not going to sign anything that gets to my desk providing, teacher pay raises and whatnot if it's not accompanied by a voucher plan. And so from the point of view of Governor Abbott and the voucher supporters, it's, these Republicans who stripped vouchers from the bill effectively doomed it in doing so. And, to take that one step further, I think the argument is, that bill, to pass legislation, you have to compromise sometimes. You have to give a little, take a little. And I think from their view, that bill had a lot of money for public schools. It was kind of a limited voucher program. And if you had to swallow that tough pill to do vouchers, then at least you're getting a lot in return. But it's been a really consistent, both rural Republicans and Democrats just putting their foot down, and whatever comes with vouchers, we're not going to go for it. So,
yeah, I mean, the other side of that argument is that once those Republicans stripped vouchers out of the bill, you had an omnibus education bill that spent $600 or $700 million on public education. That politically would have passed the House. It had the votes to do so. Yep. They didn't pass it because the governor said he's not going to sign it, so why waste their time? But that, again, is also politically risky, that the political will existed to pass that bill, but the governor refused to sign it.
Let's talk about House Speaker Dade Phelan. He did not necessarily initiate the Paxton impeachment, though he did vote in favor of it. He didn't even cast a vote on vouchers, but he is taking the brunt of the heat from far-right conservatives. He is sort of the poster child of the so-called rhino. How did we get here, and is he in danger, Zach?
So I'm going to step back for a quick second because I think contextually it's important. So polling, there was a good University of Houston poll that came out a couple of weeks ago that found that Speaker Phelan was the most unpopular sort of big Republican in Texas, which you look at it and you're like, well, that seems bad for him. It's important to understand and remember that the Speaker of the House, unlike the governor and the lieutenant governor, is not elected by voters at large. He is elected by the 150 House members. So his primary goal is to ensure that he's representing them, protecting them from difficult votes, all that kind of stuff. So he's ultimately accountable to them. So that's sort of how Speaker Phelan, anybody in his position, sort of looks at impeachment and looks at vouchers. The fact that he's taking all this heat from the governor and from Attorney General Paxton is important. And I was out in Beaumont a couple of weeks ago and sat down with him. I think that he is certainly more vulnerable than he has ever been. He is facing two challengers, one of whom is a Paxton-backed, well-funded former Orange County Republican chair. He's got credibility in the district. There's a third candidate in the race who is not super viable but could draw enough votes where I could easily see this going into a runoff, which would be pretty embarrassing for an incumbent House Speaker. And again, the race is less about who Phelan's challenger is and more about the anti-Phelan forces that are funding and sort of propping up the challenger. So I could see a world in which it's a far more competitive race than it we would normally think that it would be, but I don't know, we'll see.
Just it's the 150 House members, but it's also the voters in his actual House district who have been reelecting him for several cycles now, and I think there's a reason that it's tough to get rid of any incumbent House member, but especially a speaker. You can make a pretty compelling argument regardless of what your political ideology is. As the speaker, your district is at the table in these discussions, at the tables of power in Austin. You can kind of bring home the bacon for your district. I think Phelan has been trying to, if you just look at his messaging, I mean, he is trying to fend off these, charges that he's not conservative enough, but he's also pointing to, the stuff that he's just the kind of not super sexy stuff, but funding for local colleges and corporate tax breaks for his industry-heavy district. So I think that's one thing that gets lost in a lot of the discussion about this stuff is we haven't really seen a whole lot of public polls in his, maybe not any public polls in his race, but it's, the noise from Ken Paxton and Dan Patrick. I think there are probably a whole lot of voters in Beaumont who have only, passing understanding of who those people even are. So.
Yeah, and I would add, I think it's really interesting to see how much traction the argument against many of these incumbents is that they just aren't sufficiently conservative. I think that's been the one through line of all the attacks from the challengers that I've talked to in this cycle. It's worth noting that there really aren't many, I'd be hard-pressed to name actually more than a handful of moderate Republicans in the Texas Legislature, certainly in the House. I mean, these are all very conservative people. When I was talking with Speaker Phelan, he was sort of like, I don't know what else these people want me to say. Like, I've, all but banned abortion and supported constitutional carry and delivered on border bills. Like, these are all conservative priorities. So again, when you drill down with some of these challenges, like how is like X incumbent like not conservative enough, we sort of end up in like kind of the nitty gritty and the weed stuff of like a really popular thing among the grassroots Republicans has been the fact that the House still appoints Democratic committee chairs, a longstanding practice that existed for as long as Republicans have controlled the chamber in the modern era. It doesn't really affect voters in their day-to-day lives. It's sort of like how the legislature conducts business, but that's sort of how one of the things they've really hung their hat on and tried to make the race a referendum on. You see a lot of these billboards, saying that like ex-incumbent House Republican is in bed with the Democrats, and then when you ask them that, they're like, oh, it's the Democratic chairs thing. That's a clear argument there. So,
the Democratic chairs thing. This whole discussion about Phelan brings up. I mean, he's basically, in the big picture, getting hit for what part of his job really is as the speaker, or at least it has been traditionally in the House, which is letting members vote their districts. And when Zach, you were talking, both of you guys mentioned, the hard votes. The speaker is kind of one of his jobs is to protect members from hard votes. That can include votes that they would be pushed to cast politically, but that may be against the best interests of their districts. And so kind of one of the speaker's expectations is that they run the House in such a way that the members can get the agenda they need for their partisan supporters and for the grassroots, but also, as you said, bring home bacon for the district, take care of their district. And, I was there when House Speaker Pete Laney was at the dais and used to say regularly, members, vote your districts. And you heard that from...
No more.
You heard that from, Phelan too. And less so from some of the speakers in between. But it just seems like, there's not a lot of institutional memory, or maybe there's institutional denial about the fact that one of the things the speaker is charged with is allowing the members in both parties to bring something home for their districts. The committee chairs tradition, appointing roughly the same, share of Democrats and Republicans to committee chairs as there are represented in the House, allowing those minority party members to bring some power home to their districts. That's been happening forever. That happened even under Craddock, and everybody voted for him then, and there are members of the House that voted for speakers that appointed Democratic chairs that are now denying that practice entirely. So, it'll be interesting to see how far that goes, and if actually next session, whether it's Phelan or somebody else as speaker, where they take that.
Well, it really...
And Patrick does it too. Lieutenant Governor Patrick does it too.
Yeah, it speaks to how Dade Phelan is elected by the members of the body, and he's beholden to them, and Greg Abbott is elected by the people of the state. So I do want to jump over to Democrats, because we actually have all of the drama in the Texas Legislature has been between different factions of Republicans, but there are a few interesting Democratic races that I wanted us to talk about. And one that we've been talking about, Karen, is this Senate race in Dallas between Senator Nathan Johnson, the incumbent, and Representative Victoria Niave Prieto. Can you tell us a little bit about that race and why Niave Prieto jumped into the race?
Yeah, so it was interesting news when it happened. It basically happened. Her announcement for the Senate seat just happened a few hours before the filing deadline for the seat. So it kind of surprised everybody. But I'm going to back up just a little bit. State Representative Victoria Niave Prieto is chairman of the County Affairs Committee. She's chairman of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus. She's got several terms under her belt, just one less term than, one less cycle than Nathan Johnson, the incumbent senator from Dallas, and so it was kind of what surprised, and there was a ripple of surprise when she filed for that, and the reason was because Senator Johnson is fairly vocal. He's one of the more vocal, outspoken Democrats in the Senate chamber. He's fairly popular in his district. He's certainly visible in his district. Prieto can make a lot of the same arguments. She's got demographics on her side. The district has always been diverse, but is trending more so with every redistricting and as the district grows. And so Prieto told me that she didn't want to wait her turn, as she says women in politics often are told, and a lot of people in politics often are told. Quite frankly, she said it was time. She seemed spurred on by the border issue. Feels like it resonates, with her own constituents in that district, but also in the broader sense. Senator Johnson is leaning. He acknowledges that that the demographics are favorable to her, in that particular context. But he also can point to a pretty broad array of issues that he's fought for. In terms of kind of bringing a resume to voters, and infrastructure and water and healthcare and whether or not he's been able to put programs in place that cover more Texans with insurance, or just really kind of be the fighting voice for Democrats in the Senate. And so they have a lot of common ground, and they have a lot of reason to fight for the seat. But it's interesting on the issues, because the issues, as we've seen in kind of this other discussion we were just having, tend to be, there's not a lot of differences policy-wise between them, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. The polling is not really all that public on both sides, and they're both claiming that they're confident. So we'll see. I mean, Johnson's a pretty strong incumbent, so I think it's fairly well assumed that she does have an uphill battle.
Also, just bringing it back to our original point about how primaries are so important, this is a race where it's just the two of them. There will be no runoff, and there is no Republican primary. So the winner on March 5th is the winner.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great example of that. Yep.
Okay, well, then now we have to talk about our favorite Democratic House race. We're so into Houston this cycle. Zach, can you talk to us a little bit about who might be the most vulnerable Democrat in the state House?
Sure, yeah. The Republicans have a lot of drama, but not all of it, it turns out. So there's a House race in Southwest Houston where the incumbent, Sean Thierry, is the most vulnerable Democrat in the House in this cycle. And that's primarily because she took 2 votes last session that sided with Republicans, one on the bill restricting access to sexually explicit books in schools, and the second one prohibiting gender transitioning care for trans minors. Both of those went against the LGBT community and broke with the Democratic Party. And not just that, but she had made a now famous speech in the House last year in support of the trans care ban that really upset a lot of Democrats because they have been, the party, because they have a lot of, we're talking about the South Texas Catholics, but also older older black representatives who tend to be more socially conservative. The party has tolerated votes like that, where the bill was going to pass anyway, but sometimes the members vote with it, but they don't really make a fuss about it. The fact that Thierry really made it a whole thing and went on Fox News and talked about breaking with the party, like, really upset them. You know, I talk with other incumbent House Democrats, and they're less upset that like if she was in a district that was more moderate or more mixed. Her district, House District 146, is like heavily Democratic. I mean, Joe Biden won some of those precincts by more than 90 points. This is not at all competitive. So for Democrats, I feel like, okay, this is the one place we're supposed to have like complete support for our agenda, which includes LGBT issues, has really upset them. And the race has turned a little bit nasty in some senses, in the sense that she has a challenger who's a labor organizer and has gotten a lot of the institutional endorsements that usually go to Democrats, and it's quite shocking that they would defect from an incumbent. And also, a lot of Democrats are troubled, but that at this point, Sean Thierry's campaign is largely funded by large Republican donors, which again, it blows the mind of Democrats that would even be possible in a district that's like that. And on the trail, Representative Thierry has really doubled down on opposition to gay issues. She had a contentious editorial board screening with the Houston Chronicle a couple of weeks ago, in which she criticized her opponent, who had noted that some of the House colleagues of Thierry had endorsed her, and Thierry interjects and says, "the gay ones," and again shocks Democrats that this would even be an issue. So sorry for the long answer, but that's where the state of the race is.
Yeah, I think there's Thierry's race and another Houston Democratic State House primary that's flown a little more under the radar is Harold Dutton in kind of the opposite corner of Harris County, Northeast Houston. He took basically the same votes as Thierry, and he's kind of taken anti-transgender positions in the past, and just barely scraped by in his last couple primaries. And it's I think from both of those, it's a challenging dynamic to talk about, but I think both of those incumbents have sort of made the argument, you know, however true I don't know exactly what the polling bears out, but basically that their districts, while overwhelmingly Democratic, they're predominantly Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters. And their argument, especially among their Black constituents, is that the voter attitudes on transgender issues, book bans, that kind of stuff, just don't line up with the overall, you know, they're arguing that electorate is more conservative, less amenable to, you know, having a, you know, there was also the transgender athlete ban that I believe Thierry and Dutton sided with Republicans on that as well. So I think, you know, the March primary will kind of test how correct their argument is, just whether basically white liberals in their eyes, you know, whether it's accurate that, you know, that crowd is more amenable to these transgender issues than Black Democrats overall.
I'll interrupt you to make sure we have time for some questions from the audience. We are taking questions online at texastribune.org/ask. We've already gotten a few questions online, and in the room, if you want to come join and ask your question as well. One question from online is, how are there specific races where you think low voter turnout will specifically affect the competitive race?
I mean, I think that, and Karen had mentioned this at the start, like the fact that so few people turn out in primaries in general affects the result of the races. It's particularly tricky for Republicans, especially the incumbent ones, because they may take stances that are not just like broadly supported by Texans, but broadly supported by Republicans in Texas. But the fraction of Republicans that vote in the primary tend to be the most active and the most ideologically conservative ones. And there's a constant tension between that plays out in all these races.
There is some, I'm going to add real quick too to that. There's some concern in some of these districts that we were talking about earlier, the rural districts, that all of this is, you know, fighting over impeachment and vouchers is going to confuse voters, you know, to the point where they might just wait it out, you know. And so, you know, contributing to the low turnout, not because of the low turnout, but they're already seeing some reticence on the part of donors who don't really want to get into it because they don't fully get what the fights are all about. They don't understand why the voucher thing wasn't dealt with in legislature or can't be dealt with in the legislature. So So there's some concern that voters will stay home for that reason too.
Yeah, I think it's tough to point to any specific race where like low turnout will affect the outcome more than another. But if, on the night of March 5th, if we see any of these incumbents ousted from power, I think you could point to those districts as the ones where we really saw the effect of the low turnout borne out, just because, as Zach was saying, it's the most animated, dedicated party activists that really have an outsized influence the lower the turnout is. So any race that you see where an incumbent is ousted by a farther right opponent, I think you'd have to look at low turnout as a factor.
And I just want to add that if you think turnout's going to be low on March 5th, wait till May 28th when it's the primary runoff, where a lot of these races will go, because we have many, many crowded primaries. So you're going to have even the most politically engaged and sometimes ideological voters in that runoff.
Hi, my name is Randy Lee. I've got two quick questions on two things that you brought up and covered today. First, you referred to that $6 million donation as a donation.
Sorry, contribution? Did I say a campaign contribution?
If you give somebody $6 million for them to do something and they do it, especially in a public office, in my opinion, I would say bribe. Nobody uses that word. Just right out in the open. I'm kind of confused why the media hasn't really locked in on that. I mean, if he hadn't gotten the money, Governor Abbott probably would not even given a hoot about that issue.
I mean, he...
Go ahead. And I got a second one, short one.
Sorry, I would just say that we identified him as a school voucher advocate, and he, provided a contribution. Like, there is no explicit quid pro quo that we've reported on.
Well, I know you've got to have a specific quid pro quo, but just generally, you question somebody's veracity when something like that happens, especially out in the open. Number two, Speaker Phelan's race. I got a newsletter this morning, the Texas Voice, and somehow it ended up my mailbox for the last month, and it reported that Speaker Phelan's opponent, Mr. Covey, there are public documents that record him as a flat-out liar. He said he's an attorney, and it's on public documents for contributions. He's not licensed in any state in the United States of America. He even graduated from an online uncredited law school from California. And then he's also, a public document is available from the real property records. He signed a deed of trust for $300,000 that said an unmarried man, and he had been married for 2 years. I mean, to me, it tells me something about the veracity of people who endorse him, if they don't realize what he is and where he's coming from. Maybe I'm wrong. Help me here.
I'm not familiar with the specifics of what you are saying. I mean, I did talk with Mr. Covey when I was out in Beaumont. He is the main Paxton-backed challenger to Phelan. He's a guy in the oil and gas industry, former chairman of the Orange County Republican Party. I mean, I think that voters will ultimately have to decide, how much of what you said matters to them. But he's definitely the other viable candidate in the race.
I have family that live in Representative Stan Lambert's district and supported his vote against vouchers. My question is, did Abbott recruit someone to run against Stan Lambert?
It's a good question. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm actually shameless plug here. We're publishing a story on that race tomorrow, so stay tuned. But I was in Abilene a couple weeks ago. The opponent, there's just one in that race, is a woman named Liz Case. She is a conservative activist, has been active at the Capitol for a long time. She recently moved permanently from Dallas to the Abilene area, to Taylor County. A lot of certainly of Lambert's supporters view her as a carpetbagger, as Karen had. I'm glad you brought up. That's such a wonderful term. Because she has only recently registered to vote in Taylor County. She is heavily funded from a conservative activist named Kathleen Wall, who is from the Houston area, unsuccessfully ran for a congressional seat there. So there is some suspicion among people who live there that this person just came in and doesn't have the roots that Lambert has. He's lived in Abilene for almost his whole life. So to answer your question, was she recruited? I don't know. She certainly has well-funded backers who want to see her win, but I guess we'll leave it at that.
The timeline was hard for recruiting, too. I mean, just because that vote, I mean, Abbott had been pretty explicit in that he was going to be active in trying to get anti-voucher voters primaried, but the vote was like right up to the finish line.
Yeah, it was within a month, yeah.
Yeah, I think in a lot of these cases, too, the candidates who are running against the anti-voucher incumbents are coming from all sorts of different places. It's a lot of them come through kind of the party activist pipeline. Some of them are folks who have run multiple times before and come close in the past. I think some of them are recruited by the voucher focused political groups, but I'm not actually aware of Abbott specifically doing candidate outreach, but maybe he has.
Hi, I'm Glenn Williams. Are newspaper endorsements important? If so, which ones?
That's a great question. We do not endorse, but we've been monitoring, the endorsements that have been coming across Texas. I think that whether it matters or to voters is like a question for the voters. But I did think it was really interesting to see the San Antonio Express News go for Colin Allred over Roland Gutierrez, and I bet he would say, or that he's hoping that they don't matter.
Yeah, I would just add that I do understand the criticism of like why newspapers still endorse politicians. The Tribune does not endorse politicians. I will say I find newspaper endorsements to be really helpful in vetting extremely down ballot candidates, because look, like we cover politics and I go to vote and I'm still like, who is this person, this judge in this district, like 8 pages down the ballot? I couldn't possibly remember who they are, but the newspapers can do a good job of like in checking people's credentials, doing fact checks that other people simply can't.
And policy issues too.
Yeah, so there is a value in that.
I think also just we've seen sort of a decline in the number of just debates and public forums in recent years, especially this cycle, it feels like. And sometimes the only real arena where you see the two candidates appearing and battling it out are in these newspaper endorsements. And I know like the Houston Chronicle, we often will publish extended clips or even the whole audio of the endorsement screening, and that, I think, irrespective of the endorsement, can help people decide who they want to support.
Also, just a basic point: the editorial, the endorsements are done by the editorial boards. They're not voted on by reporters or editors. So one of the reasons that you'll still see the establishment newspapers, or what do they call them? Not the legacy, yeah. Newspapers doing them is because they still do have a very distinctive editorial section, as opposed to the Texas Tribune, which doesn't. So that's just kind of just to differentiate those that in the minds of people that may not have thought about it that deeply. It's different from the reporters.
Yeah, but to your point, Jasper, it was the Houston Chronicle's editorial board where that pretty damning interview on Sean Theory came out. So we would have never known about that if not for that. So anyway, for you to decide.
Yeah, I had 2 quick questions. The first actually is kind of a segue to what we're talking about now. Any plans to bring back the Trib Talk? It was I really enjoyed that. I don't know if that's something that's in the works. And then the second, I work for the Libra Initiative. We're a Hispanic advocacy group. So I'd be curious to hear your guys' thoughts on the Latino vote, turnout, like South Texas, trending more Republican. What other things do you guys are looking at?
Let's take the second half of that question.
Yeah, I think that the fact that we have largely non-competitive elections really hurts turnout and hurts engagement. As Karen had mentioned at the start of this, we have legislative districts that were drawn by Republicans primarily to protect the Republican Party, but they also draw Democratic districts to pack Democrats in them. So those districts often, in many cases, are also not competitive. I think that hurts everybody across the board. It leads a lot of people to believe that, what's the point of me even voting if this election really is not that contested? It's great that we have a really spirited, competitive Republican House primaries. I think that's really good for engagement, and you really see people really excited to sort of wade into that. Beyond that, the fall election in a lot of cases is a snoozer. I think that's really unfortunate for Texas across the board.
Yeah, I think, I know y'all are doing some work on this, but just one of the trends to watch is, misinformation targeted at Latino voters. That's been a big, looking back especially at the 2020 presidential race where there's all this, attention paid after the fact to these South Texas counties that either flipped blue or came about as close as they've ever been. We saw similar trends in Florida too. I think that was more of a hot spot for misinformation, but just I think that's one of the sort of below the surface kind of things that all news organizations should be trying to cover more than they have in the past. Yeah.
I mean, and just to your point about the Hispanic and Latino vote, I mean, it is the vote of Texas. I mean, Hispanic and Latinos make up so much of Texas now. It is, to some degree, more of a question in the November general, if we were going to see, maybe some of South Texas start to wobble back and forth again. That's always like, a question. I mean, in the primary, I think it's a question that we're looking at in the Senate race in North Texas between Niave Criedo and incumbent Nathan Johnson. I think
that's where the efforts are.
There's a real question about whether or not she's going to break through there because it's a heavily Hispanic district. It's a question that's on the mind in people in Houston as we're talking about issues of Democrats voting against LGBTQ issues and whether or not maybe Hispanic and Black voters are some of these issues are not resonating. I mean, I also hesitate to cast any group as a monolith, but I think that it's something that we are watching in the primary, in the general, and I think both Republicans and Democrats are trying to target and find those voters.
And I think one last point on that, the question also calls to mind how Democrats have really struggled to kind of find their voice and their messaging on immigration and border security. Again, as Rebekah was saying, it's not, it's one of many issues that South Texans and any Latino voter cares about, but it's something that it's going to dominate the 2024 election by at least the way the cards are stacked right now. And if you look at the 2022 governor's race between Beto O'Rourke and Governor Abbott, I think Beto really struggled to counter a lot of the messaging from Abbott throughout that campaign. And if you're looking at Ted Cruz he's not hiding his cards. He's going to focus on that issue. And I think, as we were talking about earlier, that is kind of one of the dividing dynamics in the primary is the best way to approach that issue. So that's a big question outlying for Democrats right now.
Oh yeah, Democrats I think would even admit that one of their weaknesses over the past few years is assuming a level of loyalty from certain demographics that hasn't proven to be true. And to your question about Trib Talk, I'm not sure, I'm just not in a position to answer that question, but thank you for your interest. We are at 10:02, so I'm gonna call it. Thank you guys so much. I'm just gonna plug really quickly, again, a few dates. You can early vote until March 1st in person. Election day is March 5th, and the runoff will be May 28th. You can find a list of candidates, every candidate for state and federal races on TexasTribune.com, and all information about how to vote. And you can read a lot of our stories about several of these races on TexasTribune.com and at the Houston Chronicle. Thank you so much.